Welcome to today's episode of the Civic Signal. This is Sam and Brandon. We're very excited to discuss a topic today that we both find very interesting and has been a point of research and discussion for both of us for a long time, and that is independent voters. Who are they? What does their behavior look like? What does their policy preference look like? And how does that compare with individuals who identify with one party or the other? So we're going to look at a Gallup article that was published this year, as well as a couple academic articles that really laid the foundation for this area of study.
So, like Sam said, we're going to start today with this Gallup article. This was published on January 12th, 2026, this year. And the headline is very provocative. New high of 45% in US identify as political independents. So, we're not going to read this whole article, obviously, but some of the headlines here. In the very first paragraph, a record 45% of US adults identified as political independents in 2025, surpassing the 43% measured in 2014, 2023, and 2024. Meanwhile, equal shares of US adults, 27% each, identified as either Democrats or Republicans.
And then skipping down here to this graph, it just shows this trend over time with red representing Republican, blue representing Democrat, and the dotted line representing independent. And we can see the sharp divergence right around 2008, marking the path of the independents on an upward trajectory.
So right under this graph, it says the 2025 findings are based on interviews with more than 13,000 US adults throughout the year. In each survey, Gallup asks US adults whether they identify politically as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. So remember this question that they asked, because a little bit later in the video, this is a very important methodological step that greatly shapes the results and the implications.
And then looking at this chart here, it has it mapped out by generation. So Gen Z, our generation, Brandon and I, is pulling in at 56, more than half, 56% independent. Millennials closely behind at 54% independent, with Gen X at 42, still pretty close to that 45 number. And then with the baby boomers and the silent generation pulling more strongly toward the parties. And so the key takeaway seems to be, if this is all you look at, that younger Americans are dissatisfied with the political parties and are politically independent from that system.
So this is all that we're going to look at here on this article. We're definitely going to cite and link this in the description like we always do. So if you're interested in learning more about this article, check out the video description. But we wanted to talk a little bit about the implications of this article if you take it at face value. So 45% of Americans are identifying as politically independent of either party. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, like you said, if we take that at face value, that means that every single campaign on a national level and many, many campaigns at the state and local level come down to capturing this politically independent group in the middle who could shift to one direction or the other. And it makes every political encounter not about left versus right, but really about which group can get the most out of this group in the middle, and particularly for young generations. And by young, we would mean anybody Gen X through Gen Z.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. But that actually raises an interesting discrepancy, because if you're paying attention, it doesn't seem like most young people are politically neutral. Young people have very strong and sometimes extreme political views on both sides. It doesn't really add up to me that there are 56% of young people that are up for grabs in any given election, like this Gallup poll is suggesting.
Now, as we mentioned earlier with the article, they asked, do you identify as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? They don't say the exact way they phrase it, but they do say that those were the three options that they were given. We're going to look at another way that this question is often asked. It was developed in the 1950s by the ANES survey, which has sort of become the model for many surveys to follow and much of the academic research that takes place in the political science realm today. which provides an initial question that looks something like this. Generally speaking, do you usually think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what?
So, like Sam said, this creates three categories that respondents are grouped into. This data doesn't match exactly what the Gallup poll had in their article. This is the 2024 ANES data. It doesn't show as high of a number of independent voters, but it does show that there are these three main categories, and independence is a significant amount of the population.
And then once people have answered the initial question, then they're asked a series of follow-up questions. If they answered Democrat or Republican, they're asked if they would consider themselves strong or not very strong. And if they answered independent, they're asked if they would consider themselves closer to the Republican or the Democratic Party. What this does is this creates a 7-point scale: strong Democrat, weak Democrat, independent, lean Democrat, true independent, independent, lean Republican, weak Republican, and strong Republican. What we can see here is that the independent, the true independent from a party, it drops down to just less than 7% of the population.
So this raises a really important question, and this is a methodological decision that researchers need to make, is where do you draw your categories in this 7-point scale? Gallup, it seems, used this top method where strong and weak Democrats were considered Democrats, independent lean Democrats, true independents, independent lean Republicans are classified as independents, and weak Republicans and strong Republicans are classified as Republican. And that's how you get these three big groups. However, the political science research community has researched this in depth and made the decision that a more accurate way to classify American voters is to group the independent leaners into either party. And we're going to talk about why they make this decision. But as you can see, when you make this decision, the number of Republicans and Democrats in the population jump up to 45 to 50%, while the independents is a very small number, like Sam said, very different from the third to half percentage point that the Gallup poll suggested.
The first article we want to look at is by Dr. John Richard Petrocik. It was published in 2009. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we're just going to look at two articles, and this is a little bit older. There is more recent research on this, but this was really one of the foundational pieces of political science research in this area, and the vast majority of the research in this area has corroborated and replicated results very similar to this. And so rather than looking at the newer versions that replicate these findings, we're going to go back to one of the foundational articles, and it's entitled Measuring Party Support, Leaners Are Not Independents. And some of the questions that they ask or that they look into are, where are the important breaks in that 7-point scale, right? So we looked at, is it between the weak Republicans and the lean Republicans, or is it really between the true independents and the lean Republicans? Where should we make the distinction? The data for this article was collected by the Inter-University Consortium for Social and Political Research, and we're going to look at a couple of figures instead of looking at the entire article like some of our videos focus on. We're going to just look at some of the findings here that are most critical for these questions. So this first figure is labeled Party Supporters 1952 through 2004. And so what this shows is if we include leaners as a partisan, how often do those groups vote for that party in an election? And so what we see here is very consistently, we see that 83% to 94% voted for that party. This next figure, which is labeled as figure 4 in the article, which of course we have linked down in the description below if you want to look more into depth into this, shows how likely each group it was on average across all of the years to vote for the Democratic Party. The highest year over that 50-year range is represented in red. The average over those years is the middle line. And then the lowest year over that range is represented on the bottom line. And so what we see here is between about 75 to 95% of the time, strong Democrats voted for Democrats. And then if we look at the independents, splits pretty close to the middle. On the average, over to the strong Republicans were very, very unlikely across all 50 years to vote for a Democrat. But what's really interesting about this here is we see a dip down on weak Democrats that goes back up for the leaners. And then we see the inverse on the Republicans, which is a dip down on the leaners, which means a decrease in likelihood to vote for the Democratic Party. And then a bump, an increase on the weak Republicans, which represents more likely to vote for a Democrat. And so what this seems to show is that individuals who say that they're an independent who leans toward one party actually act more partisanly than those who identify themselves as someone who identifies with the party, but only weakly, as a not so strong or a weak Democrat or Republican.
So this Petrocik article looked at voting behavior specifically, but what about actual policy positions? And this is going to be the subject of the next article we're going to look at, which is a 2012 article by Dr. David B. Magleby and Dr. Candice Nelson called Independent Leaners as Policy Partisans, an examination of party identification and policy views. So what these researchers do is they look at the policy positions of each of these 7 party identification categories on 5 major political issues of the time. And those 5 issues are the Affordable Care Act, the 2009 stimulus package, the war in Iraq, abortion, and gay marriage. And so again, we're just going to look at the figures and the results from their analysis. So all 5 of these figures are shaped the same way. On the y-axis, we have the support percentage from 0 to 100. And then on the x-axis, we have the 7 groups from strong Democrat all the way to strong Republican. So the first issue is the Affordable Care Act. This data comes from the CCES 2010 and the Kaiser Foundation 2012. And what we see here is a very similar shape from the graph Sam described in the Petrocik's paper, where you see this strong support for from strong Democrats, slightly weaker support from not very strong Democrats, and then again, strong support from independent leaning Democrats. There's kind of this U shape in the graph. We see it inversely on the Republican side, where the strong Republicans do not support the Affordable Care Act. The not very strong Republicans don't support it, but at a slightly higher level. But then the independent leaning Republicans are somewhere between the weak Republicans and the strong Republicans. So this next graph is the 2009 stimulus legislation. This is the CCES 2010 survey. And we see the same shape, the U shape here and the inverse U shape here, where the independent leaning Democrats and Republicans are more partisan than the not very strong Democrats and the not very strong Republicans. This is the graph where they ask if the Iraq war was a mistake. This is the 2006 CCES and the 2010 CCES, and it's the same exact story. This graph shows those favoring always allowing legal abortion, 2006, 2008, 2010 CCES, and again, the same shape. And finally, this one shows opposition of an amendment banning gay marriage from the 2010 CCES. And again, we see the same shape where in this case, the independent leaning Democrats actually oppose this amendment more than the strong and not very strong Democrats. So overall, what these graphs show is that independent leaning partisans act more partisan than even some partisans who will admit that they are Democrats or Republicans.
After reading these articles and looking at this very clear trend that we see in the data, this makes me wonder who really are the independents and how are we getting this picture wrong?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this professor, Professor David B. Magleby, was actually one of the authors on a book called The Myth of the Independent Voter. And again, this is old data. This is from the 90s, but it holds up today. They look at specifically who are the pure independents who lean to neither side. And what they found is that the pure independents are those who are less interested in politics, they're less likely to vote, they're less politically knowledgeable, and they're less likely to participate in or donate to a political campaign. So those pure independents, 2024 ANES had it just below 7%. Those people who are affiliated with neither party are actually the least politically active out of all of the people. So if this is true, what is the implication of this on elections? And how does it differ from the story that was implied from that Gallup poll that had 45% of Americans as independents?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because the Gallup article is certainly not unique. Every single election cycle, we'll see this again in 2028. We'll see it again after. We'll see it soon in the midterms this year. We're going to see, oh, it's a scramble to pick up the independents. Who can win over the moderates? And realistically, that's just not the case. And it is important to win over moderates, but realistically, the most important thing that a candidate can do is to mobilize their co-partisans. And really who they're trying to win over is they're trying to win over their own co-partisans who may have enough hesitations that maybe they wouldn't come out to vote for them to convince them that they do want to get out to vote for them. And we are not the first people to realize this. This is not some niche idea in the political science community. If you watch elections, politicians, especially at the national level, and once we get down to smaller local levels, this doesn't apply quite as much. But on the national level, if we look at for president, for example, the candidates are not campaigning trying to win over the undecided middle of the road voter. They are trying to get their own base excited, fired up, worried, angry, whatever emotion they can evoke to try to get their base to take action. That is what they're trying to do. If you look at political media, whether it's social media or news outlets or podcasters, whatever it is, they're focused on mobilizing the people who already agree with them. And if they can win over some other people, that's great. But their primary goal is to mobilize their co-partisans.
So, if I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is that the pot of undecided voters that Gallup suggests is upwards of 45% is not nearly as large. And the way you win elections is you get your own side out to vote rather than try to win the people in the middle.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think that that raises another question that's really important is if 45% of people initially will tell you that they're independents, but most of those people lean to either side. And if they lean to either side, the data shows that they vote and support policy positions at the same levels as the partisans. Why won't they admit that they are members of the Democratic or Republican Party?
This is actually, well, it's a great question. And part of the reason that it's such a good question is that we don't really know the answer. There are several very compelling ideas that we can discuss, but I would love to see more research into this area. It would be pretty difficult to really pull off and get people to be vulnerable in their emotions. It's really easy to capture people's party preferences, their political knowledge, and their policy preferences. It's really difficult to survey people's emotions and their motivations. And so one reason that I think at least maybe part of it is that people see high levels of political activity in others around them, and they don't necessarily want to be grouped into the same group as those people. And so if they know a strong Democrat or a strong Republican who's very intense and who has socially undesirable qualities due to their political involvement, they don't want those qualities to be mapped onto them by other people. And so by saying that they're independent, that's not to say I don't care about politics in their mind, but rather to say I'm not crazy. What are some other ideas that you think?
Yeah, I think most of my ideas are along those lines. Never in US history has politics been such a big part of so many people's lives. And with that circle of politically active people getting bigger and bigger, there's going to be a lot of ugliness in the conflict in politics. And I think we've seen that specifically in presidential debates over the years, is those are really ugly. And I don't blame people for not wanting to be associated with either side explicitly when they can see how ugly the news is and how ugly social media can be.
Yeah, totally. I think key takeaway here is when you see a headline, um, it's usually not as intense as maybe the headline makes it seem. And when it comes down to it, when you're looking at an election and you're looking at why people are behaving the way they're behaving, it can help to understand that they're not really trying to capture the middle. And when someone does win an election, it's also important to realize, and we can look at every single one of the recent presidential elections going back for decades, they didn't win because the exact middle of the road, undecided person overall supported them. They won because they got more people who supported their side out to vote. That's very important for understanding American politics and the way that our system works is he or she who mobilizes their side more wins. It's not about winning the little guy in the middle.
Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you've made it this far, we'd love if you'd subscribe. We just reached 50 subscribers on the channel, which we're really excited about. We'd love to grow that number even bigger. Leave a like and a comment if you have something to add. We'd love to hear what you have to say, and we'll catch you in the next video.